The golden lights of Hollywood have a way of blinding us to the shadows that stretch behind the legends. For decades, we saw Angie Dickinson as the epitome of the unreachable American dream, a woman of fierce independence, smoldering presence, and a revolutionary spirit that redefined what it meant to be a leading lady in a man's world. She was the face that launched 1,000 daydreams, the first true female action star who could hold her own against the toughest titans of the silver screen. From the dusty landscapes of Rio Bravo to the gritty, neon-soaked streets of Policewoman, she didn't just play a role. She commanded the screen with a sensuality and strength that was almost unheard of in an era that preferred women to be either victims or domestic ornaments. But as the cameras stopped rolling and the red carpets were tucked away, a much darker reality was unfolding in the quiet corners of her life. Now, at 25 years old, the legendary star has finally decided that the time for protection is over. For more than 70 years, she carried the weight of secrets that would have shattered the reputations of some of the most idolized men in entertainment history. There is a specific kind of courage that comes with reaching the winter of one's life. It is the courage of a woman who no longer has anything to lose, no roles to be passed over for, no studio executives to appease, and no fear of the industry turning its back on her because, in many ways, she has already outlasted the system that tried to break her. In a stunning and chillingly clear revelation, Angie Dickinson has broken her silence to name 5 men who did more than just break her heart. These were men she once loved, men she trusted with her career, and men she even shared her bed with. But today, she looks back at them not with the nostalgia of a former lover, but with the cold clarity of a survivor who realizes she was a victim of a coordinated culture of control and betrayal. This is not a story about petty Hollywood grudges or the fading memories of a starlet. This is an investigative journey into a blacklist that was written in pain and maintained through decades of silence. Angie is no longer interested in mercy. She is interested in the truth. She stands as a living witness to a time when a woman's entire life could be destroyed by a single phone call or a refused invitation. The names on this list are not obscure footnotes in history. They are the architects of American culture: Frank Sinatra, Burt Bacharach, Jack Webb, Larry King, and Johnny Carson. To the public, they were the kings of Hollywood, the masters of melody, and the voices of a generation. To Angie Dickinson, they were the men who sought to own her, silence her, and eventually erase her. As we peel back the layers of these 5 relationships, we begin to see a pattern that defines the dark underbelly of the Golden Age. It was a world where fame came at a devastating cost. And for Angie, that cost was often her very soul. She was dropped from major projects simply because she refused to sleep with the men in power, proving that her talent was never enough to insulate her from the predatory nature of the business. While the tabloids painted a picture of a glamorous sex goddess, the men behind the scenes were using far crueler words to describe a woman who dared to say no. Her life was a series of high-stakes gambles, where the house always seemed to win, yet she remained standing, even when a part of her died alongside her beloved daughter, Nikki. Why speak now? Perhaps because at Chinwiba, the ghosts of the past are louder than the whispers of the present. Perhaps because Angie Dickinson understands that her story is the story of thousands of women who never got the chance to point an accusing finger at their tormentors. She is naming those who destroyed her sense of self, who abandoned her in her moments of greatest need, and who used their immense power to ensure she would never stand tall again. This is her final reckoning. This is the truth about the men she truly hated more than anyone, and the long, agonizing road she traveled to finally find her voice in a world that tried its best to keep her quiet. As we prepare to enter the inner circle of Frank Sinatra's influence and witness the golden cage he built for her, we must ask ourselves, how much of our history is built on the broken lives of women like Angie? The journey through her blacklist is not just a look back at old scandals. It is a profound exploration of survival, the cost of integrity, and the enduring power of a woman who refused to be forgotten. To the outside world, the pairing of Angie Dickinson and Frank Sinatra was the ultimate Hollywood fantasy, a collision of two of the most magnetic forces in American culture. They were the golden couple, a vision of high society glamour that the public consumed through glossy magazine covers and breathless tabloid reports. But behind the velvet curtains of Sinatra's inner circle, the reality was not a romance. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Angie would later describe this period not as a love affair, but as the most dangerous relationship of her entire life, a time when her identity was slowly being erased by a man who demanded absolute possession. Frank Sinatra, the king of swing, possessed a charm that could make millions of women tremble with a single blue-eyed look. In the beginning, he used that charm like a precision instrument to dismantle Angie's defenses. He made her feel as though she were the only woman in existence, overwhelming her with a level of attention that felt like royalty. There were flowers delivered every single morning, private, candlelit dinners by the pool, and constant whispers that she was unlike anyone he had ever met. It was a seductive trap, designed to make her dependent on his approval. But the moment Angie showed a flicker of the fierce independence that had made her a star, the mask of the romantic lead dropped, revealing a man who was controlling, cruel, and deeply insecure. The turning point came when Angie's professional life collided with Frank's need for total dominance. She was at the height of her powers, a leading lady whose sensuality was her trademark, yet Frank could not tolerate the very career that had brought her to him. When she accepted a role that required her to perform a screen kiss with another man, Sinatra's reaction was explosive. He didn't just express jealousy. He threw the script at her and delivered a chilling decree. "You're mine. No one touches you, not even on screen." This wasn't the protective love of a partner. It was the territorial claim of an owner. From that moment on, Angie's life became a golden cage, beautiful from the exterior, but suffocating within. Sinatra's control extended into every crevice of her existence. He banned her from seeing male friends, effectively isolating her from her support system. He had her followed on film sets, ensuring that his eyes were on her even when he wasn't physically present. The psychological pressure was immense. Once, after she dared to attend an audition for a project he had explicitly disapproved of, she returned home to a scene of domestic devastation. Her personal belongings had been destroyed, and every photograph of the two of them had been burned, a symbolic execution of their shared history meant to teach her the cost of defiance. Sinatra never felt the need to physically restrain her because he had mastered the art of breaking her spirit. He taught her to fear her own voice. He controlled her filming schedules, her contracts, her co-stars, and even her hours of sleep. It was an all-encompassing surveillance that left her feeling like she no longer existed as an individual. In her journals, she would later write the heartbreaking realization that Frank didn't actually want her to love him. He wanted her to forget that any other human being in the world existed. The ultimate betrayal of her career occurred in 1970. Angie had been offered a leading role in a prestigious, critically acclaimed independent film, a project that could have redefined her as a serious dramatic actress. But Frank, true to his pattern of sabotage, made a phone call in the dead of night. He contacted the director at hum a.m. and delivered an ultimatum. "If you keep her in that movie, you'll never work in Hollywood again." The role vanished by the next morning without a single word of explanation to Angie. She was a star, yet she was being treated as a pawn in a game of power she could never win. Looking back from the age of Chinmuiba, Angie Dickinson doesn't just remember a lost romance. She remembers a theft. She loved the man every woman in America dreamed of, but she paid for that love with her very soul. She survived the king of swing, but the scars of that golden cage remained with her for 7 decades, a reminder of the time she was never truly allowed to be herself. If the relationship with Frank Sinatra was a golden cage, then Angie Dickinson's marriage to Burt Bacharach was a vast, cold desert. To the world of the 1970s and 70s, they were the ultimate power couple, the stunning Hollywood star and the brilliant, Grammy-winning composer whose melodies defined an era. They married in 1995 at the absolute height of their respective fame, moving into a sprawling Beverly Hills mansion that seemed to promise a lifetime of creative synergy and domestic bliss. But behind those gates, the music was hollow. Angie would later state that she didn't just hate Bacharach. She loathed him, not because he was a bad husband, but because he was a man who ran away from his own blood wearing a designer suit. The crack in the foundation appeared almost immediately after the birth of their only daughter, Nikki Bacharach. At a time when medical understanding was limited, Nikki was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. For Angie, this was a moment of profound fear and desperation. She was a mother spiraling into confusion, looking for a partner to help her navigate the unknown. But instead of finding a pillar of support, she found a man who viewed his daughter's disability as an inconvenience to his creative flow. When Angie held their shaking baby in her arms and looked to her husband for guidance, Bacharach's only response was to ask if the child's condition would affect his recording schedule. From that moment on, the marriage was a ghost. While Angie carried the entire weight of raising a child with severe needs, Bacharach chose escape. He sought refuge in the arms of beautiful women, on private yachts, and during endless nights in Las Vegas, claiming he needed inspiration while his wife cried alone in their mansion. The cruelty was not just in his absence, but in his utter lack of empathy. Angie recalled a specific instance when she called him, begging for a signature on a critical medical request for Nikki's treatment. His response was ice cold. He was busy recording and told her never to call him again unless the child was dead. But the betrayal went even deeper. While Angie was pregnant and at her most vulnerable, Bacharach was engaged in an affair with a young singer. He didn't even have the decency to keep the betrayal secret. Angie recounted waking up in the middle of the night to hear the laughter of her husband and his mistress downstairs while she slept nearby with their newborn child. To the public, he was the man who wrote, "What the world needs now is love." But to the woman who lived with him, he was the man who shattered the fragile world of a child who desperately needed her father. By the time they divorced in 1991, the press characterized it as an amicable split, but for Angie, there was no peace. She survived the marriage, but she could never forgive the man who abandoned his daughter to a life of struggle. When Nikki took her own life at the age of Bon Mui, the silence between Angie and Bert became an unbridgeable chasm. At Jinweba, Angie looks back on this era not with sadness for a lost love, but with a burning resentment for a man who possessed the genius to move the world with music, yet lacked the heart to love his own daughter. While Angie Dickinson's personal life was often a battleground of emotional control, her professional life was governed by a different, more shadow-shrouded set of rules. In the 1995, the entertainment industry was not just a place of art. It was a hierarchy of absolute power, held by a few men who could make or break a career with a single sentence. For Angie, the most haunting of these figures was not a lover or a husband, but a man who functioned as a gatekeeper to her very livelihood. Jack Webb. To the American public, Jack Webb was the face of law and order, the no-nonsense creator of Dragnet who revolutionized the police procedural. He was a television mogul who demanded precision and stoicism from his actors, often insisting they read from teleprompters to strip away acting in favor of cold, hard realism. But behind the scenes, Angie Dickinson encountered a man whose demand for control extended far beyond the camera angles. Webb was a man every actress was forced to smile at, even when they were breaking inside, because they knew he held the keys to the kingdom. The collision between Angie's integrity and Webb's power occurred with chilling speed. At the height of her fame, Angie believed she had earned a level of respect that shielded her from the cruder demands of the industry. She was wrong. She later recalled a specific moment when she refused to sleep with him, assuming her status as a household name was enough to protect her. The response was not a discussion or a professional disagreement. It was an immediate and total erasure. Within just 12 hours of saying no, Angie's world changed. The next morning, 3 major roles she had been cast in vanished. Contracts that had been signed and sealed were cancelled without a single word of explanation from the studios. The industry whispers followed her. Like a ghost. You said no to him. You're finished. It was a public execution of a career, performed in total silence. No one dared to say his name in meetings, and no one would meet her eyes in the corridors of the power players. Webb had the power to turn a leading lady into a nobody with a single phone call, and he used it to punish her for her defiance. Angie didn't cry in front of the cameras. She quietly cleared out her dressing room, realizing a painful truth that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could win over audiences of millions, but she would never defeat the system that these men had built. This was the era of the casting couch, long before there were hashtags or public reckonings. For a woman in her chinmuis to still carry this anger reveals how deep the wound went. It wasn't just about the lost roles. It was about the realization that her talent was secondary to her willingness to be used. Jack Webb never had to touch her to destroy her. He simply removed the floor from beneath her feet. This act of professional sabotage remains one of the most significant chapters in Angie's blacklist, a testament to a woman who chose her dignity over a career, even when the price of that choice was her entire future. If the titans of the studio system like Jack Webb controlled Angie Dickinson through her paycheck, the next man on her list controlled her through her heart and her privacy. Larry King, the suspender-clad voice of American media, was not as physically imposing as a studio mogul or as globally iconic as Frank Sinatra. However, Angie would later recall that his form of love was perhaps the cruelest of all, because it was disguised as a desperate, all-consuming devotion. While the public saw a high-profile romance between a legendary actress and a rising star of the airwaves, Angie was living through a slow, deliberate dismantling of her life. The relationship began with the same intensity that characterized all of Larry King's 8 marriages. He didn't scream, he didn't hit, and he didn't use public insults. Instead, he used the tools of his trade observation and interrogation to map out the boundaries of Angie's world and then slowly begin to shrink them. He made her believe that no one had ever loved her with such singular focus. And for a woman who had spent years being treated as a disposable asset by the industry, this attention was initially seductive. But every touch and every vow was carefully calculated to bind her tighter to him. The architecture of this control was built on a foundation of extreme jealousy. Larry King reportedly watched her with a predator's intensity every time she smiled at another person. If she arrived home a mere 10 minutes late, the gentle persona would dissolve into an explosive interrogation. The psychological pressure was so immense that Angie began to lose the very things that made her who she was. Her laughter faded. Her work opportunities were quietly discouraged, and her circle of friends began to drift away, unable to deal with the suffocating atmosphere of the relationship. Perhaps the most chilling revelation of this period was the extent to which the king of talk radio used technology to maintain his grip. In a pre-digital age, he took surveillance to a level that felt like a scene from a thriller. He allegedly secretly installed a microphone in her car, desperate to hear if she showed even the slightest affection for another man while she was away from his sight. It was a relationship built on the idea that love and surveillance were one and the same. When Angie finally attempted to break free from this captivity, the emotional manipulation took a dark, self-destructive turn. King reportedly spiraled, using his own pain as a weapon to keep her from leaving. In moments of crisis, he would drink heavily or even physically harm himself, such as slamming his head into a mirror, only to bleed onto her shoulder while whispering that his love for her was driving him insane. It was a classic cycle of narcissistic control, making the victim responsible for the tormentor's well-being. At Jinmui Ba, Angie Dickinson reflects on this time with the clarity of a survivor who has finally learned that real love never comes with fear. She once believed that pain was the price one paid for a great love, but she now recognizes that Larry King's devotion was not a tribute to her. It was a prison designed to ensure she never existed outside of his shadow. For 40 years, the memory of this relationship haunted her, a reminder of how easily a woman's freedom can be stolen by a man who claims he is only trying to keep her safe. The final name on Angie Dickinson's blacklist is perhaps the most shocking, because it belonged to a man the entire world considered a friend. Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late night, the master of the living room who brought a sense of comfort and laughter into millions of American homes every night. To the public, his chemistry with Angie was legendary. She was a frequent and favorite guest on The Tonight Show, often engaging in high-spirited flirting that defined the era's thinking man's sex symbol. They even dated in secret for a time, a relationship that was whispers in Hollywood but never confirmed until decades later. But behind the warmth of the studio lights and the undeniable charm, Angie encountered a man who used his public platform to issue a private, devastating threat. The betrayal occurred on a night that should have been a triumph. Angie had been invited to receive a prestigious recognition for her decades of work in the industry, a moment the press heralded as a triumphant comeback for a screen legend. However, moments before she was to step onto the stage, the atmosphere shifted. Carson had reportedly been shown a clip from an old, unreleased interview where Angie had briefly mentioned a powerful producer who was later accused of significant abuse. In the high-stakes world of 1970s and 80s television, such a mention was a liability that could ignite a scandal and turn the star into a target. Instead of warning her privately or acting as a protective friend, Carson chose to use the live broadcast to exert his dominance. As they sat together in front of a live audience, he leaned in and delivered a warning disguised as praise. He called her a woman who knew when to speak and when to remain silent, a sentence that sounded like admiration to the applauding audience, but felt like a cold blade to Angie. It was a public signal that she had crossed an invisible line, and a reminder that her career was still subject to his approval. But the betrayal didn't end with a whispered threat. Angie later realized that the same man who publicly embraced her was quietly working behind the scenes to stifle her future. In the years following that night, her name began to vanish from award nomination lists and high-profile opportunities. No one questioned it, and no one investigated the sudden cooling of her career prospects in late-night circles. Only Angie and the man with the charming smile knew the truth. She had sought his loyalty as a friend, but he had chosen the approval of the industry and the audience over her. This was the final blow to a woman who had already survived the golden cages of Sinatra and the abandonment of Bacharach. To be betrayed by a man who claimed she was family was a humiliation that stayed with her for nearly 20 years. At Chinmoy Ba, she looks back at those guest appearances not as moments of glamour, but as the most degrading nights of her life, where she was forced to perform while the man sitting across from her was orchestrating her professional silence. As the curtain begins to fall on this Chin Mui Ba-year-old's final reckoning, we are left with the image of a woman who is not merely a relic of a bygone era, but a towering monument to endurance. Angie Dickinson entered Hollywood as an outsider, with a love for poetry and no formal training. Yet she managed to outlast the very men who sought to contain her. Her journey through the blacklist is a testament to the fact that while power can steal years and roles, it cannot steal the truth once a person decides to own it. Today, she lives quietly in Beverly Hills, finding peace in the simple rituals of gardening and the solace of the California sun. The tragedies she endured, the psychological surveillance of Larry King, the professional erasure by Jack Webb, the public betrayal by Johnny Carson, and the cold abandonment by Burt Bacharach would have shattered a lesser spirit. Yet the most profound weight she carried was the loss of her daughter, Nikki, in Hang In Lea Bai. Nikki, who lived with Asperger's syndrome and struggled to find her place in a world that rarely understood her, chose to leave it at the age of Bon Mui. Angie's response to that heartbreak was the same as her response to Hollywood. She didn't perform her grief for the cameras. She wrote a single devastating sentence, "I survived," acknowledging that while part of her died with her child, her spirit remained unbowed. At Jinmibon, Angie Dickinson's final message to the world is not one of bitterness, but of hard-won wisdom. She has learned that the secret to vitality is to stay out of trouble, to be kind even when she wants to swear like hell, and most importantly, to know when she has said enough. She has forgiven herself for the choices made in the name of love and ambition, but she refuses the false grace of forgiving those who intentionally sought to destroy her. She stands as a reminder that not everyone deserves a place in your history, especially those who use their power to silence yours. Angie Dickinson was the original femme fatale who proved that strength and sensuality were not mutually exclusive. She was the woman who told Johnny Carson, "I dress for women. I undress for men," reclaiming her agency with a single quip in a world that tried to dress and undress her at its whim. Her story serves as a bridge between the old casting couch culture and a new era of accountability. By naming these 5 men, she has ensured that their legacies will forever be viewed through the lens of the lives they impacted. She had her day in the sun, and by all accounts she is content. But in breaking her silence, she has given a final, powerful gift to future generations of women in the industry: the courage to say no, the strength to survive the consequences, and the ultimate power of having the last word. The starlight of her career may be in its twilight, but the truth she has revealed will remain as a guiding light for years to come.